Well, fewer presentations would be the... Thank you. Good morning. So I don't know, I've not been on this side of the room before. I'm very inclined to do like a cooking show right here. It just kind of has this like an army of like pots and pans and be like, and here it is 45 minutes later. So I don't have the utensils though. Wow. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to Teaching PHP and Web Development. This is me. I've already spoken to a number of you that are planning on attending this, and in fact are in the process of attending this. And most of you are already teaching PHP and web development, which makes me think that I probably have nothing to tell you. That's not going to stop me from talking for 40 minutes because, I already got the microphone. But I'm going to tell you what I have figured out. In case you're not familiar with who I am, my bona fides. I've written a few books. Quite a number of articles. I was extension instructor for the University of California at Berkeley. Did this for a few years from like 2002 or 2001 to like 2007, back when getting online classes was just getting started. Yeah, that was an experience there. I've also taught many live courses, primarily like government organizations and corporations where I'll go in for a day or a couple days or a week and teach primarily PHP, web development, Oracle, SQL, that kind of thing. So I also make really good cheesecakes. Not going to be relevant today because, again, we don't even have an oven. But, it might come in handy. Basically, I've done PHP and web development instruction for about 12 years now, many different formats. Rumor has it I'm pretty good at it. At least people keep hiring me to come back. But before this presentation, I never really thought systematically about the process. I mean, I've figured out a number of things over the years. And if you're going to have me teach a class this week, I could easily do it. But I've never really thought about what I think about in that process. So that's what I'm going to try and share with you today, is my process for making these decisions. Historically, I've mostly just been winging it with experience. Maybe I've learned something by creating this presentation as well. 4 general topics. This is going from just getting started to creating your instruction materials to actually doing the instruction. We've got identifying the constraints, creating the content, making tough decisions, and implementing the plan. Along the way, I'm going to have plenty of recommendations and best practices for coming up with a smooth, successful instructional program. I think the most important thing is going to be the making tough decisions, because that's what any teaching is about, is making tough decisions about what you say, what you don't say, what you use as examples. If you have any questions at any point in time during the presentation, go ahead and raise your hand, throw something out at me, go to sleep, some sort of sign to let me know. It's no problem to interrupt me during the presentation. And of course, you can get me anytime the rest of the day or after the conference. So the first thing you're going to need to do is identify the constraints. Notice I'm not starting with the goals. Some people think you need to start with the goals. Well, that's kind of wrong thinking, because your goals are going to be constrained. Okay? You have to identify what constraints you have before you can come up with the goals of the course, not the other way around. I can't teach everything about PHP in like 200 pages or in 2 hours, right? We all know that. So let's look at what our constraints are first. First going to be, I've been talking for 48 straight hours, so. As opposed to my normal Hollywood caliber voice. Constraints, the first one you have is the medium. I would include writing as a way of teaching, whether you're writing books or writing articles. It is a type of teaching. Obviously, I'm biased. You also have, live teaching. You have video, which is an interesting hybrid. With the constraints, if you're writing, how many pages do you have? How many words do you get? These are some of your constraints. If it's a live course, how many hours do you have? And keep in mind, something like having 20 hours over, say, 3 days means you can actually teach less than having 20 hours over 3 weeks, because there's only so much information you can give them within a certain amount of time. Videos are tricky. You don't really have the same kind of constraints in time and space, except at some point in time, people are going to stop watching your video. So there is a limit to how much you can put out there. Another constraint comes from your students or your readers or your audience, whatever it is, you're going to want to call them. And basically this is, what do you expect your students know coming into the course? So what assumptions are you making? Do you expect that they know HTML? Or do you need to cover HTML? Do you expect them to know CSS? Do you expect them to know HTML5? Later on, you're going to have to keep that in mind and tailor your content to that constraint. And what I would normally recommend is beginning slightly ahead of what you expect everybody to know. So if you expect them to know HTML and you're teaching PHP, why don't you go over forms a little bit just to make sure they understand, methods and these kind of, the form method, those kind of things. At the very least, people are often unaware of what they don't know, or they think they know something, but they really do. And this gets you all on the same page. So identify what your assumptions are and get to that point. Keep in mind, I think we've all had this experience where some people are not meeting those minimum requirements when they come into the class or the book or whatever, and you're like, we'll see what we can do here, guy. So you've got the time and space and your student assumptions here. Now you can define the goals. Now these are, as I said, these are going to be defined by the constraints you have. Materials where you're starting off with beginners, like you just can't go as far as you can if you're assuming like an intermediate level. If I'm teaching PHP for someone who's already done any kind of programming, it's a different experience than if I'm teaching PHP for someone who's only done HTML. And then the same goes for the amount of time or space you have. If you have 400 pages versus 600, you can go different lengths. If you have an hour versus 3 hours, obviously you can go different lengths. Now, this is going to make these goals, the end point where you expect to get to, is going to make a huge difference in terms of how successful it is and how happy your students are at the end of the day. I'm of the opinion you can always start too early, right? You'll never, you'll keep the beginners with you. The more advanced people will go ahead and sleep through it. That is fine as long as you get far enough. What you don't want to do is start too early and not get far enough for the advanced people, because that'll piss them off. But you also don't want to start too far ahead and lose the beginners from the get-go, because they will never get any of it. So if you're going to make a mistake here, and you're going to make a mistake in terms of how you schedule this, err on the side of starting a bit too early. If you get advanced enough, you'll get away with it every time. And that also gives you the flexibility of going faster, going slower as the course continues. I would argue that there's 3 goals that every instructional experience needs to include. You've already decided that you're going to go to the point of doing, object-oriented programming. You're going to do MySQL, SQL, PHP, blah, blah, blah. So you've already figured that out. 3 other goals every experience should have. One is provide a sense of the big picture. This is the hardest thing with technology for newbies to get. They know HTML, and now you've thrown in PHP, and now you've thrown in MySQL, which means you've also thrown in SQL. And the reason, there's many reasons this matters, one of which is when they get that error message, they need to be able to understand, is this an SQL problem? Is this a MySQL problem? Is this an HTML problem? When you've thrown all these components together, they lose sight of the roles they play. So constantly provide a sense of the big picture. Second, encourage them. I'm not a teacher by training. I assume this is something I would hope that they teach from the beginning of how to be a teacher, encourage your students. Programming, web development is a frustrating life, right? I still, to this day, have problems where things aren't working largely because it's doing exactly what I programmed it to, which is quite an annoying behavior. And you just sit there and I had a full head of hair before I started programming. Which is kind of true. I was, 12, so I did have a full head of hair. But, you need to encourage them to keep them able to push through this whole thing. And what I have found is I don't have a technical background. I have a degree in English literature with a minor in philosophy and religion. I have the most impractical education one could find, right? What that meant is when I started writing technical books, I wrote it from a non-technical perspective because I don't have a technical perspective. I remembered what frustrated me, and I relayed that to the students when I was teaching them. So as you're learning things, try and remember what was hard for you, what was confusing for you, and let them know that too. And finally, no matter how good you are, they're not actually going to leave your book or your class or whatever actually knowing everything that you taught them. It's just not the way the brain works. I could go with you're going to teach them how to fish kind of thing. You need to show them the manuals, documentation, how to debug, that kind of thing. Basically, what I would say is you're not actually teaching them PHP and web development. You're teaching them how to learn PHP and web development. You're teaching them how they're going to do it. There are some people who are visual and like videos, and they're going to learn that way. There are some people who learn by reading and reading and reading. There are some people who only learn by doing. The only way to make all of those people happy is to give them the tools they need so that they can do those things for themselves after the class or after the book is done. No questions. Excellent. Oh, was it almost a question? No. Okay. So once you've identified the constraints and you've laid out your goals, you're going to start creating the content. 4 ideas here I've got. 4 ideas you're bringing to this. 1 are the space and time constraints. 2, the expected starting point knowledge for your audience. Your desired ending point is 3. And then those 3 additional goals. And basically, you've got this starting point and you've got this ending point. And your goal now is to shovel the right amount of information in there in the right order. Selecting content. I like to start on the most macro level, the biggest topics. You're going to cover maintaining state. You're going to cover SQL, defining functions, whatever. These topics all go towards that end goal, basically where the student should be at the end of it. Then you're going to start organizing these topics. And this is where you start hitting your first tough decisions. Obviously, SQL needs to come before MySQL, right? There's no other way of doing it. And you have to do that before you start talking about PHP and MySQL. But like, where do you discuss sessions? Where does that come in? Well, it actually doesn't really matter where you discuss sessions. Arrays, are you going to discuss those before you discuss control structures or vice versa? And I'm going to give you a couple of specific examples later on. The organization of the material is going to make it easier to learn or not learn. You also need to put it into manageable chunks. A 50-page chapter is kind of a no-no unless it really needs to be 50 pages. 4 hours of live instruction without breaks, pretty much going to shut everything down. On the other hand, you're going to come up with, you're talking about dates and times. Well, that's like takes this much time, So is that actually a unit, or do you lump that in with something else? These end up being some of the decisions you have to make. Within the topics, you're going to have to go into specifics. So you're going to discuss for loops, and you're going to discuss while loops, but not do while, because it's just not as important, and you don't have space. Procedural code or object-oriented. The specifics end up being the concrete knowledge that the student walks away from. You're not going to get in trouble for having bad organization unless it's really, really bad. But if you don't have the right specifics, people are going to be disappointed in what you've done. You also need to structure the specifics within the topics. This can be tricky. For example, do you want to do a for loop or a while loop first? Well, they're different. They're used in much the same way, but for different purposes. How do you do this? This is all going to be dictated by your examples. And good examples are going to make all of the difference. Your examples need to be as real world as possible. I cannot stress this enough. They need to be as real world as possible. Nobody likes to be in the class hearing, here is something you could do, which you would never actually do. Don't waste their time. And basically, if you organize it right, you can sometimes build up the examples over time, which does a couple of great things. One, it saves you time and space if you build off of existing examples. And two, it actually reinforces what they know. If you start off with a form and handling a form, and if you start off with like a contact form, and then handling the contact form, and then that demonstrates one concept. And then you throw in security of validating that form. And now you've used the same example again, but they still understand the form part. And then you throw in the mail function at the end, and you're still reinforcing the stuff they've learned and just adding one more thing. It makes it easier for them to understand and reinforces what they've been learning along the way. For live classes, I actually like to do live examples on the fly. Whatever the people there are interested in doing, that's what I like to do as my example. If I go into a corporation, they might have a sense of what it is they want to do. Do that example as best as you can. You're going to have to apply some constraints to it, like you can't do everything, but give them a sense. It'll make the learning that much more applicable. Once I have a strong sense of the topics I'm going to cover, and basically I've laid it all out, I then start doing other research. I've probably reread the PHP manual for every other book that I've done. You don't know what new things have come out. Sometimes I read other people's books. Mostly I'm doing this to see if they've discussed something that I'm not planning to discuss, and if so, should I? It's far, far better to think about an idea and rule it out than to have never thought about it in the first place. Now, I'm probably reasonably stubborn and egotistic, so of course my ideas are normally right the first time. But at least try and get some other input. Don't steal other people's examples, but other than that, go ahead and see what other people are doing and reevaluate the decisions you've made. To me, good writing and good teaching is all about making decisions. What do I cover? What do I not cover? So get as much input as you can and make those decisions. I don't care how good you are as a teacher or as a writer. If you haven't made the right decisions to that point when you're doing it, it's just not going to work out. Next, you're going to need to select the supporting materials. The most important are the online resources. This is tricky. How many people here would recommend W3 Schools as a resource to use for, no, raise it. Would you? Let me ask why. W3 Schools, yes, right. Yes? That's what you use. Okay. Anybody know why, yes?
Oh, and the triad.
The what?
The triad, they have the triad.
The triad?
W3 Schools, so that you get the little window to go.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. What is the downside of using W3 Schools?
The footer says that
Not everything on the site is 100% correct. W3 Schools comes up first and early in searches. Some of it may be correct, some of it may not be correct. Correctness is kind of important when it comes to teaching. On the other hand, I don't find the PHP manual problematic, but I know people who do. It is the authoritative resource, but it's not the most accessible resource. So you're going to have to find, yes ma'am? Right. Right, so her point is that W3 Schools covers JavaScript and regular expressions and PHP and MySQL, so it's a one-stop shopping for it, which is true. I guess my counter would be, are there better one, like, is SitePoint a better reference? It doesn't have, I don't think SitePoint has manual-ish stuff, but, my point would be is there a better reference to use? And I don't actually have a solution here either. I'm just saying these are the tough decisions you have to make. Yeah, W3 Schools is very accessible, which is great. But maybe you teach them, okay, if you want to start there, that's fine, but you're going to need to get in the habit of double checking some of these things. So, yes, sir.
Can I, on a self-referential comment, I'd like to say that trashing other websites or sources is actually a good way to start contentious discussion and annoying comments in your teaching.
Okay, are you actually talking to me now? Is that what we're saying? No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm kidding.
No, it is, it's like, I was just saying to my intern the other day, who I've been teaching PHP and MySQL, I said, there are some absolute
Yeah. Well, okay.
It sounds like you have a negative.
Okay. Well, it's great because of this, of course, is exactly what you're saying about how if you make a blanket statement about something, then you do run the risk of either offending people or having people disagree or whatever. Do I have a negative? I have a concerned opinion of W3 schools, and in part because they always come up like first in search results. I like accessibility. I think that accessibility in terms of as an educational standpoint. The other accessibility, I don't know. What's that? That's a good question. Do I like Microsoft? Here's the thing about Microsoft. I, like many other people, went through my Microsoft bashing years. Maybe with some reason, maybe lack of my own education. And, opinions change. I mean, Microsoft, look where we're here now. Microsoft has done all this for my understanding, is nothing to give all the space. I mean, look what they're doing for open source. So my general attitude is that if you keep learning, your opinion changes. So my main concern with W3 schools is that they do always appear first, and sometimes it's not entirely accurate. So I really actually wasn't trying to suggest that we don't use W3 schools. It's just these are the decisions you have to make. I happily turn people to the PHP manual, but then I'm surprised to find people say, I have a hard time with that. And I thought, oh no, but I've lost sense. Sir.
But I'm hijacking your lecture with people raising.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Who else? Yes? Did we make up somebody raising their hands? No? Okay. What's that? Okay. So yeah, in case it's not obvious, I'm kind of fascinated that so many people would recommend W3 schools. It's not that I ruled it out, but so it's interesting to see different perspective. So also the additional support materials gives them something to walk away with like a live class. I know some excellent books for when it comes to like teaching PHP and web development. I mean, if you just want, I can give you some recommendations of some top-notch books. Tools are another tricky thing. They're going to use some tools for web development. Two categories: the student's development tools, and then the server. If it's a book, you're probably going to want to tell them just install an AMP stack of something, Apache Friends or Bitnami or whatever. If you're doing a live course, you really want to have a central server, okay? It's too much work to try and get everybody up to speed on their own computer. I am 100% an advocate of, if you're learning web development, install PHP and MySQL on your computer. It's free, it's easy, there's no reason not to. But in a live course, you don't want to start off with trying to get everybody up to speed. Plus, if you use a central server that everybody has access to, that server is configured the same for every single person. So in theory, they should get the same results for the same program. Development tools is really tricky. What you need to do is tell them they have to use Emacs. That's what you have to, absolutely have to use. So, do you go with one common tool for like everybody, or do you let them use whatever? If it's a beginner course, they would probably appreciate if you said, use this. Yes, ma'am. Oh, that's okay. So when she did this, she said she created a virtual machine that would install not only the server tools but the development tools on everybody's machine, and you had the same thing of having a consistent interface, but you've also thrown in the development tools. So, what did you use for the virtual machine? Just VirtualBox. Okay. Does that perform well enough reliably across people's machines? It's been a while since I've used VirtualBox. So. Excellent. Well, that is a wonderful idea. And there's also, I lose terms. Is it Puppet or Chef that, he does your configuration and gets you up to speed or something? There's many ways. This has become automated for us now. And that's a great recommendation, that you could do a VirtualBox which has everything in place. And that also they wouldn't have to FTP anymore, which would be nice as well. Pardon? You burn out DV and give it to them. right? But like they wouldn't have to like when I was saying with the central server, they would still need to FTP or get it to the central server, which is an added complication. So that's a good suggestion. Thank you. So yes, sir.
The only other thing I can think of with respect to servers is setting up Apache and MySQL and all this other stuff is more of a system admin thing than it is a programmer thing. PHP just did add
Yeah.
a built-in dev server, so that might be a good alternative.
But no, it is true that is all system administration stuff. And when you're already introducing 3 new concepts, the idea of throwing in installation of Apache, et cetera, is yeah. So I was stunned in one book. I added mod rewrite, and like I've spent a year answering mod rewrite questions. I thought, oh, I thought we were kind of all with that, but we weren't quite yet. So, okay. Pardon me? I thought it was. Okay. They're on. Hello. Hello. Wow. This is the one. What's it? Exit panic. Let's reboot it. Oh. Battery. Awesome. Oh. I guess so. We'll do it that way. This is awesome. That's right. Okay. Rockstar. Okay. I've never in my life have I do this, I think is what I've never actually used a microphone like this. I'm going to be try not to throw it down on the ground after I'm done. Microphone stand. So, okay. All right, where are we at? We are doing a presentation here. Okay, so I mentioned in passing some of these tough decisions that you're going to have to make. Let's look at some more of them. There's rarely, as I say, there's never absolutes. There's rarely going to be absolutely clear answers, but I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons here. A little bit of what I'm going to say will be heretical, which is the way good teaching should be. First question, do you give the students what they want? So isn't it great that that's a question? A specific example, if you are, from a marketing perspective, whether you're doing a class or a book, you're trying to get people to buy it, to attend the class or to buy the book. Do you have a chapter or a lesson on security? Security is not a one lesson chapter thing. There's not 5 things about security that you need to learn and then that's it. Security is something that needs to be stressed at every point in time. However, if you create an outline of a class or a book that doesn't mention security, some people will not buy it, will not attend, because you're not talking about security. And how could you have this class without talking about security? Even if you put in the introduction, hey, or in whatever in the material, I'm actually going to talk about security everywhere, blah, blah, blah. They're not going to read that. So they need to see a chapter that says security, a module that says it. I would argue you just go ahead and do that in that particular case. You talk about security throughout the whole class. You get to a chapter and, or you get to a lesson and you teach 3 or 4 other things. But you have to be cognizant that people are making decisions about attending or not attending or reading or not reading. And they expect to see certain things in there, even if you have to fake it a little bit. Does this work? Did I just skip? Did I skip? There we go. All right. One of the hardest things about teaching development programming is that there's the way things are done in the real world, and there's what beginners are capable of learning. And depending upon the example, that can be a really huge gap. For example, if you're teaching how to upload a file, okay, that's not an easy sequence because you need to tell them how the form needs to be different. And then you need to tell them that it gets uploaded as a temporary file. And then it gets moved to another place, but that place actually has to have the right permissions on it, which is actually something that Windows users, it ends up being easier on them because it's not a, that moves right. But you have to have the permissions, right? So just getting that process of a file uploaded and stored in a permanent location takes a fair amount of learning. You haven't validated the file type. You haven't renamed it. You haven't moved it outside of the web directory and incorporated a proxy script task. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you could go with that. What I normally do in those situations, I guess another example would be like mail. Here's how you use the mail function: you send an email. Oh, by the way, if you just take the form data and put it right in there, like, you're going to get spam left and right. And that's what I normally do, is I say, this is what you do. By the way, there are some issues here which we will get to later. I don't think it's a problem presenting suboptimal routines if you acknowledge that that's what you're doing, okay? If you say, keep in mind, you wouldn't want to use this on a live site because it doesn't do a couple of things yet, but let's get this down. This, one second. This also has the added benefit of it allows you to build upon that example. So in one lesson, you go ahead and say, this is what you do. In your security chapter, you then validate the file type and give it a unique name, and et cetera, et cetera. So it allows you to build up the example over time. They get the basic knowledge and the real world implication later on. Yes, sir?
So just going back to your forms uploading, which is that's a great example because it is so complex. What you're saying is if you're teaching a painting student, you probably do all the show and mod stuff in advance and like basically set it up, kind of help them set it up for them. Like you wouldn't actually walk them through, and now we're going to change the file system permissions and stuff like that. You'd say, look, we're going to do it here and we're going to copy it here.
Okay, so the question is would I talk about the file system and the permissions and such before? If I'm doing a class for beginners, I would actually talk about the file permissions and show them what they need to do. And I would also say, you know, one option is to go ahead and do it, and if you get this error, then we need to go back and do this other thing. You can go ahead and wing it like that if you want. For more intermediate level people, I would say the permissions need to be open. If you actually don't know what that means, then you need to look up blah, blah, blah. So that I would start, because all of these decisions take time. And when you talk about X, it means you're later not going to be able to talk about Y, because you have this much space. So I would toggle that based upon the expected load. Yeah. Again, like if I'm sitting in a room and it's a bunch of you know, Windows laptops, they're actually not going to have that permissions issue. So, you know, I can get away with it. I would probably want to make them aware that this could be an issue later. Yes, sir?
I guess the one comment I would add is, as you're developing a course, you have all, you know, you figured out your constraints and your goals, like you said, you're going to make mistakes. Some of those worksheets realize that you may not finish the course.
Yeah.
You may not reach all of those because you may discover that the students suddenly realize that on their Windows machine or their Mac machine, neither one of them is case sensitive. Then if you have to upload it to the Unix server, it is suddenly case sensitive, and what used to work no longer works anymore. And then you have to have that lecture about Unix. So there will be times about Unix permission. So there's going to be times where, like, you know what? I think we're just going to have to slow down and let's discuss this. And then the more you teach, the more you realize that, oh yeah, this is going to be a problem. You know already. And then you can tackle it earlier, so it's possibly not a problem.
Right, absolutely. So his point was that realizing ahead of time that you may not get through all the material. And I actually mentioned that later. I'm going to speed up a little bit here. Okay, next, also blasphemy. Should you be 100% technically accurate? Excellent. We say no. How many people think you need to be 100% technically accurate in, you know, your teaching? All right, should I just go to the next slide then? So, what's that? Yes. Oh, wouldn't you need to? Yeah. So, O'Reilly books. Anybody here have heard of O'Reilly, I think? O'Reilly books are technically wonderful. I think we can all agree on that. They got some of the leading experts, and they write technically wonderful books. Not the best books to learn from, okay? Not the best books as an instructor. In my opinion, I have a biased opinion. Let me give you an example. If I'm teaching C, and I talk about strings, I have just lied to my students. There are no strings in C. You know, C has an array of null terminated characters. So when I talk about strings, should I say an array of null terminated characters? I think strings is an understandable concept, even if it's not technically accurate. When it's particularly on the fence, what I would do is tip my hat to it. I would say, you know, strings, and then say, by the way, it's not technically a thing, but I'll get to that later. So, oh man, I'm rocking this thing now. So I'm okay. Thank you, though. I think I'm okay, but I appreciate it. So just strike a balance there. This is a big debate. I think we're really quite fortunate that PHP can be used in a procedural or object-oriented way. I get really annoyed by all the people who say object-oriented is the only way to do it. I get really annoyed by the people who do procedural and don't think you ought to learn object-oriented. There's no one right solution. If I'm writing, 3-page application, I probably don't need objects, or I would use some classes that already exist. If you're creating a web application on Team, you probably should be using objects. My only concern here is that teaching object-oriented programming in book form, as a matter of fact, look at this book. I have heard good things about this book. So PHP Advanced and Object-Oriented Programming, had to get that in the title. Object-oriented programming, I think, took 200 pages there to cover. If you're going to teach a class, it's at least half a day, if not a full day, to teach object-oriented programming. You may or may not be able to do that, depending upon your constraints. But it's something you're going to have to make a decision on. There's a great middle ground I've discovered with object-oriented programming, is that the theory is what takes forever to explain. But you can show them the syntax and how to use existing classes. Go with the date-time class or the MySQL class, and you can show them how to use object-oriented programming without defining their own classes. It familiarizes them with the concepts and gets them started down that path without giving up a whole day to go into great detail. Ordering, what you're going to end up with tough decisions. My best example is arrays and loops. You can't teach a for each loop without knowing about arrays. So you can teach the arrays first, and then I guess do it later. But then in the arrays chapter, you're not going to do the for each loop, and so you have to make some tough decisions there. There's a few other places where you're going to come across it. Some instructors and books will go ahead and I'm going to show you this thing, which you actually don't know at all, but it's how it's done, and just confuse everybody. In these kind of situations, you have to find the lesser of two evils, either introducing too much concept or faking it. I would err on the side of faking it and not confusing your readers. So, you can do loops first and cover a for loop that, counts from 1 to 10 or whatever. It's a bit of a bullshit example, but it'll give them the basic concept. And then you can do arrays and do the for each loop there. That's the way I end up playing it out. Finally, avoid redundancies. This is actually true whether you're teaching or whether you're programming or whatever. A lot of programming and web development is doing the same thing over and over again. Redundancies help reaffirm, that's not even a word, settle ideas, but they also take up time and space, right? Like if you have a class and every time they need to create a new HTML page and they need to go file, new, blah, 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 and do all that and create the HTML and change the title and whatever else, that's eating into time. Try and avoid that as much as possible, and this is where I like to build up examples over time. So, you start off with the contact form, you handle the form, you then add validation, you then add the mail function. They're actually keeping the same thing. They can just open it in their browser. It should be familiar with them, but you don't have those hiccups of having to reinvent the wheel every time. Or, I try and normally get templating in as early as possible. So breaking into simple, break into header and footer and use includes. And that way they don't actually have to worry about layouts. They're creating an application, but they don't have to worry about layouts and all the other HTML stuff, and they can just focus on PHP very early. Finally, we're going to implement the plan. This is after defining our constraints, creating the content, making our tough decisions. This is where you're actually teaching or writing the book. I expect at least half of us here have done more teaching than I have, from what I can tell. So I don't know that I'm going to teach you anything here. But I'm going to talk anyway, because I have the microphone. So whether you're writing or teaching a class, go ahead and revisit the outline one more time. Try and mentally walk through it. Check your examples. Do you have an example early on that's going to be too hard? See if you can eliminate redundancies and build up examples over time. And make sure you're presenting the big picture repeatedly. Choose the right tools. I'm going to skip ahead since we talked about that one. Obviously, I'll say two things. One, if you go with an IDE, it actually minimizes programming errors in theory. It's a little bit harder to learn. On the other hand, programming errors is how you learn how to debug, which is one of the hardest things to teach. I think we all know the one thing you can't do is ask any seasoned programmer to change their tool. You can't even ask them to think about changing their tool. So I think we also all know Sublime Text is the one true text editor. So that's right. Yeah, see, indeed. I'm so sick of hearing about Sublime Text. I bet I've just gotten sick of hearing about version 2, and now I have to start hating version 3. Okay, so choose the right tools. Manage emotions. Your students are not going to learn well when they're frustrated, and being frustrated is a large part of what programming is. So try and manage their emotions. I got 5 recommendations. 1, get out of the gate fast. One of the examples I love doing is a PHP info script. PHP info script is very easy to do. It allows them to write a PHP script and execute a PHP script to make sure they have that process working. Has great bang for your buck. Look at all that information you get. And it conveys very valuable information. What version of PHP are you using? You've just done 4 goals with one simple little one function call example. You don't even need to do any HTML in the page. So I like to do a PHP info right away. Look, you can do it. Second, make it practical. This is where I like to do live demonstrations that mean something to them. Make it as applicable as you can. Reinforce what they've already learned. This is the idea of building up examples. Hey, you actually do know how to handle a form, and now we're just taking that data and putting it into a database. So you understand this already. We're just adding this. Acknowledge that it's hard. This is great for managing emotions. It is hard. Some of it isn't as hard as they think it is, but it's hard. Give them that. Remember what frustrated you. And of course, take breaks. My other recommendation, especially on a live course, is that you make mistakes. I would recommend that you make mistakes. Many reasons, one of which is it teaches debugging. If you are doing a live example on the fly, you are going to screw up, no matter how good you are. This shows them that it happens. If they screw up, you screw up too, it's all okay. It's also going to show them how you deal with debugging, right? So don't go into your class with perfect code that's going to execute flawlessly, because you're only teaching them this much. Do some examples on the fly, screw up, and show them how you handle that. When I first started doing live teaching, and I like to do live examples, I screwed up quite a bit, and it just turned out to be useful information. It wasn't by plan. Finally, and this was already suggested, is to roll with the punches. You're gonna, like, some things are gonna take longer, some things are gonna take shorter. You're not gonna get as far as you want. If you use up all your material and you have more class time, you can always do another example to reinforce the point. It's very easy to extend that, but change it up. You just can't force too much knowledge into one person's head. And finally, if you do nothing else in your course, give them a sense of what's next. What are the specific topics they should look into next? What should they practice next? What resources should they turn to? This is not the end-all and be-all. You need to give them more examples. In my books, a couple of years ago, I started adding a review and pursue section at the end of chapters. The review was a reinforcement of what you should have learned, and a pursue was prompts for things that you should do on your own. This allows them to try different examples, to show them what they already know how to do, to extend themselves a little bit. So most importantly, give them hard information for where to go next. Despite all the types of teaching I've done, I've never really formally thought about the process. I've no doubt internalized a lot of this information. And it's been kind of interesting to think about this. I wonder if thinking about this is going to change what I do in the future, or if I'm going to continue to wing it. Hopefully not. But when all is said and done, I think teaching PHP and web development comes down to this. Whatever format you're using, don't think of that as a whole thing. A book is not just teaching PHP and MySQL. A class is not just doing that. You're not actually taking the students on a journey, to be overly poetic about it. You're actually helping the students begin their journey. Whatever you're doing that week, or with that book, or whatever, that video, it's not a whole thing. It's a start of a thing for their sake. And that's, in my opinion, how you teach PHP and MySQL. So, Thank you. We have approximately 48 seconds for questions, or until they kick me out. I also want to mention my man Gene is doing PHP Percolate. Season 6 starts September 1st. You buy this book for 20 bucks or get it from the library. I have heard this book may be the most beautiful thing ever written. From like 100 years of solitude caliber material. Anyway, if you're interested in learning PHP and MySQL, I don't know many of you are. They do this great course, and Gene is the man who you can also ask about any questions. Okay, yes, sir.
For this class, how many hours would you use to teach the book?
That's it. Okay, so the question is, how many hours would I use to teach this book? That book is like 600 pages. It's a bit much. How many hours? I could do it in 40, I would think. That might be a little aggressive, but I think I could do it in 40. It'd be better to be spaced out. So the last, what's that? Let's say 30 if you don't go into too much detail. The end chapters are example chapters. I'd say 30-ish. I would say if you had 60 for it, you could really rock it. So yeah, I think 30 might be, you'd have to make some editorial decisions, which obviously I didn't. And then 60 would be lovely, I think. Anybody else? All right, then. Hey, enjoy the rest of the conference. If you ever want to get a hold of me, I'll be around. So thank you very much. I appreciate you guys coming out. Throw down my microphone. Yes, sir. Oh, wait. Oh.
What?
I forgot to give
Oh,
my
you forgot
book
to give
away.
the book away.
Oh, see, I don't even know. Are you speaking next?
How many chapters?
Oh, I should just take it longer. I don't know. All right. How do I give this away? All right. I am thinking
I'll
of
take it.
a number between